Rome once called him the perfect prince, the son of a beloved general, the darling of the Roman people, a young emperor welcomed with celebration across the empire. His name was Gaius Caesar, but history remembers him by another name, Caligula, the emperor who, according to ancient writers, declared himself a god, humiliated the Roman Senate, and even planned to appoint his horse as a consul of Rome. A ruler so cruel, so unpredictable, that the Roman elite eventually assassinated him inside his own palace. For nearly 2,000 years, the verdict has been simple. Caligula was mad. But there is a problem with that story. Almost everything we believe about Caligula was written after his death by historians who belonged to the very class he spent his reign humiliating. So the question is unavoidable. Was Caligula truly the most insane emperor Rome ever produced? Or did Rome create the monster it needed to explain his fall? Tonight, we reopen one of the darkest reputations in Roman history.
To understand how Caligula became Rome's most infamous emperor, we must begin long before the stories of madness. We begin with a child. His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, born in the year AD 12 into one of the most celebrated families in the Roman world. His father, Germanicus, was not merely a general, he was a hero of the empire. Roman soldiers adored him, the public trusted him. Many believed he would one day rule Rome himself. As a boy, Gaius often accompanied his father on military campaigns along the northern frontier. The Roman legions found amusement in the sight of the child dressed in miniature military boots, caligae, the heavy sandals worn by soldiers. They began calling him Caligula, Little Boots. It was a nickname given with affection. At the time, no one could have imagined it would echo through history with such a different tone. The child grew up surrounded by loyalty and admiration. To the legions, he was the son of their beloved commander. To the Roman people, he was the living symbol of a family they trusted. But Roman politics rarely allowed such promise to remain untouched. In AD 19, Germanicus died suddenly in the eastern provinces. The circumstances were controversial, and suspicion spread quickly. Many Romans believed he had been poisoned under the authority of the emperor at the time Tiberius. Whether that accusation was true or not, the consequences were immediate. The death of Germanicus transformed his son into something more than a child of privilege. It made him a figure of sympathy, almost of mourning. The Roman public watched closely as the young Caligula and his family were drawn into the increasingly dangerous orbit of imperial politics. Tiberius, aging and increasingly distrustful, withdrew from public life to the island of Capri. Rome itself became a place of rumor, accusations, and quiet disappearances. One by one, members of Caligula's family fell victim to political intrigue. His mother was exiled. His brothers were imprisoned and later died under suspicious circumstances. The young Gaius survived, largely because he learned something essential about power very early in life. He learned when to remain silent. By his late teens, Caligula was summoned to Capri to live under the direct supervision of Tiberius himself, the very emperor many believed responsible for his father's death. It was a dangerous arrangement. Ancient writers later described the atmosphere of Capri as deeply unsettling, a court defined by paranoia, surveillance, and shifting loyalties. Caligula, still barely a man, had little choice but to adapt. He observed, he endured, and above all, he waited. When Tiberius finally died in AD 37, the Roman world responded with extraordinary enthusiasm. After years of suspicion and repression, the empire believed it had been given a fresh beginning. The Senate confirmed Gaius as emperor almost immediately. The Praetorian Guard supported him. The people celebrated in the streets. For Rome, Caligula represented renewal, the son of Germanicus, the child once cheered by the legions. A young ruler who seemed destined to restore the dignity of imperial power. And at first, the promise appeared genuine. Debts were forgiven. Political prisoners were recalled. Public games and celebrations returned to the city. The early months of Caligula's reign were marked by relief, even optimism. Contemporary accounts suggest the Roman population welcomed him with genuine affection. For a brief moment, the empire believed its golden prince had finally taken the throne. But history rarely moves in straight lines. Within a year of his accession, something changed. Ancient sources describe a severe illness that struck the young emperor not long after he assumed power. For weeks, his survival was uncertain. Rome held its breath. When Caligula recovered, the tone of his rule began to shift. The generosity of his first months gave way to unpredictability. Decisions became harsher. Relations with the Senate deteriorated rapidly. Stories of humiliation, cruelty, and excess began to circulate through the capital. The Golden Prince Rome had welcomed so eagerly was becoming something else. Whether this transformation was the result of illness, trauma, calculation, or something far more complex remains one of the most debated questions in Roman history. But the legend of Caligula's madness does not begin with certainty. It begins with change. And in the next chapter, that change would reshape the empire and ultimately seal the fate of the emperor himself. For the first few months of his reign, Caligula seemed to fulfill every expectation Rome had placed upon him. The young emperor moved carefully. He honored the memory of his father. He restored certain political privileges to the Senate. And most importantly, he appeared to listen. The city responded with enthusiasm. Public games were held in celebration. Debts owed to the imperial treasury were temporarily reduced. Exiled citizens were allowed to return. For a brief moment, Rome believed the long tension of Tiberius's final years had ended. But the calm did not last. In the autumn of AD 37, only months after his accession, Caligula fell suddenly and violently ill. Ancient accounts describe the emperor confined to his chambers for weeks. His condition deteriorated so dramatically that rumors of his death spread through the capital. Temples filled with citizens praying for his survival. Senators waited anxiously, unsure whether Rome would soon face another succession crisis. Then, unexpectedly, he recovered. The emperor returned to public life. But something about him appeared different. Several ancient writers, most notably Suetonius and Cassius Dio, describe a visible shift in temperament following the illness. The restrained young ruler who had initially charmed the Senate now displayed a colder and far less patient disposition. Whether this change was physical, psychological, or political remains uncertain. What is clear is that Caligula began to test the limits of imperial authority. Executions became more frequent. Some targeted individuals previously accused under Tiberius. Others were directed at members of Rome's elite who had once seemed secure in their position. The emperor did not always explain these decisions, and silence in Rome was often more unsettling than cruelty. At the same time, Caligula's relationship with the Senate deteriorated rapidly. The Roman political system still maintained the outward appearance of a republic. Emperors ruled, but senators expected to retain dignity and influence within that arrangement. Caligula seemed increasingly uninterested in maintaining the illusion. Accounts describe him mocking senators openly during formal sessions. At times, he is said to have forced prominent men to run beside his chariot through the streets of Rome, a gesture designed less to punish than to humiliate. These moments were theatrical, and theater has power in politics. For centuries, historians interpreted these episodes as evidence of instability, proof that the emperor had descended into irrational cruelty after his illness. But another possibility exists. Caligula may have understood something that many emperors before him had struggled to control. the Roman Senate remained the most dangerous political audience in the empire. Humiliation, however brutal, could serve a purpose. It reminded Rome's aristocracy that imperial authority no longer required their approval. Whether driven by calculation or by temperament, the result was the same. Fear began to replace admiration. Members of the Senate spoke more cautiously in public. End quote. Private conversations grew sharper, more dangerous. Reports circulated quietly through aristocratic households that the emperor's behavior was becoming unpredictable. But unpredictability can be a powerful weapon. And Caligula, by now barely in his mid-20s, had inherited an empire where survival often depended on appearing stronger than one's enemies believed possible. The Golden Prince, who had once entered Rome to celebration, was beginning to rule in a very different atmosphere. Suspicion, resentment, and the growing belief, whispered carefully, never too loudly, that the emperor himself might no longer be entirely rational. Whether that belief was justified would soon become the central question of his reign. Because in the years that followed, the stories surrounding Caligula would grow stranger and far more dangerous. In the next chapter, we examine the scandals that transformed a controversial emperor into one of the most infamous figures in Roman history. By the second year of his reign, the image of Caligula had begun to fracture. What had once been interpreted as confidence now appeared as arrogance. Decisions that might have been dismissed as youthful excess began to take on a more disturbing pattern. And from this point onward, the stories surrounding the emperor became increasingly strange. The most famous of these concerns a horse. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, Caligula planned to appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a consul of Rome. The animal, he writes, was housed in a marble stable, fed oats mixed with gold flakes, and surrounded by servants tasked with maintaining its comfort. For centuries, this story has been repeated as proof of the emperor's madness. But historians remain divided. Some believe the story was exaggerated, perhaps even invented as political satire. In a society where the Senate claimed authority over governance, the idea that a horse might perform their duties just as effectively could have been intended as a calculated insult. If that interpretation is correct, the episode reveals something very different from insanity. It reveals contempt. Caligula may not have been attempting to elevate a horse. He may have been ridiculing the men who believed they governed the empire. Whether the threat was real or theatrical, the effect was unmistakable. Rome's aristocracy felt humiliated. But the horse was only the beginning. Another set of accusations soon followed, darker, more scandalous, and far more difficult to verify. Ancient writers claim that Caligula declared himself a living god. He is said to have appeared publicly dressed as Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods. Statues of the emperor were reportedly placed within temples normally reserved for divine figures. Worship, according to these accounts, was no longer limited to the traditional pantheon. It was directed toward the emperor himself. Such behavior would have shocked Roman sensibilities. Although emperors were often deified after death, declaring divinity during one's lifetime crossed an invisible boundary between political authority and religious sacrilege. But here again, the sources must be examined carefully. Roman emperors regularly associated themselves with divine imagery. Augustus had done so subtly. Later, emperors would do so openly. Caligula may simply have pushed the symbolism further than the Senate considered acceptable. The difference between political theater and genuine delusion is not always easy to distinguish, particularly when the surviving accounts were written by those who felt personally threatened by imperial power. Yet the accusations did not stop with divine pretensions. The historians of Rome also describe acts of extreme cruelty, executions carried out with little warning, political rivals eliminated without formal trial, public punishments designed not merely to discipline but to intimidate. Some stories go further still. Suetonius records claims that the emperor took pleasure in watching violent spectacles. Cassius Dio describes banquets where fear, rather than celebration, filled the room. And then there are the most sensational allegations of all: rumors of incest with his sisters. These claims appear prominently in later Roman histories, yet the evidence supporting them is thin, based largely on hostile commentary rather than official records. In Roman political culture, accusations of sexual deviance were often deployed as weapons. They were intended not simply to describe behavior, but to destroy reputation. Whether these particular rumors contain truth or invention remains impossible to determine. What matters more is that by the 3rd year of his reign, the portrait of Caligula in elite Roman circles had transformed completely. He was no longer the Golden Prince. He had become something far more dangerous. A ruler unpredictable enough to humiliate senators, wealthy enough to ignore financial restraint, and powerful enough to punish anyone who challenged him. Fear spread quickly through the Roman aristocracy, and fear has a way of sharpening narratives. Stories grow darker. Motives become monstrous. Memory rearranges itself to justify what must eventually come next. Because when rulers inspire more fear than loyalty, the end of their reign rarely arrives through debate. It arrives through conspiracy. In the next chapter, we examine the forces gathering quietly within the imperial court and the moment when Rome decided that the emperor himself had become intolerable. By the 3rd year of Caligula's reign, the relationship between the emperor and Rome's ruling elite had deteriorated almost beyond repair. For generations, the Roman Senate had viewed itself as the guardian of the republic's traditions. Even under imperial rule, senators believed they remained an essential pillar of Roman authority. Caligula appeared determined to challenge that belief. He did not simply govern the Senate. He humiliated it. Ancient sources describe repeated episodes in which prominent senators were forced into public embarrassment. Some were ordered to run beside the emperor's chariot during ceremonial processions. Others were mocked openly during formal assemblies, their opinions dismissed in front of their peers. In Roman political culture, dignity was power. Strip a senator of dignity, and you stripped him of influence. Whether intentional or impulsive, Caligula's behavior eroded the fragile balance that had allowed emperors and aristocrats to coexist since the time of Augustus. And resentment began to harden. But resentment alone does not rewrite history. For that, something else is required: narrative. The version of Caligula most people know today comes primarily from 3 ancient writers: Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and fragments of Tacitus. None of these men were eyewitnesses to the early years of the emperor's reign. Most wrote decades later, drawing on earlier accounts produced within elite Roman circles, the same social class Caligula had repeatedly antagonized. This does not mean their writings are false, but it does mean they were written from a particular perspective. Roman historians were rarely neutral observers. Their works were shaped by political loyalties, personal grievances, and the moral expectations of their audience. An emperor who humiliated senators would not be remembered kindly by those senators' descendants. And so, the portrait of Caligula that survives in Roman literature is not simply the record of a reign. It is also the product of interpretation. Stories of cruelty grow more vivid. Acts of arrogance become symbols of madness. Rumors once whispered in private acquire the weight of established fact. Consider again the famous story of the horse consul. If Caligula truly intended to appoint incitatus to Rome's highest office, the act would represent one of the most bizarre political decisions in Roman history. But if the episode began as satire, a calculated insult toward senators he believed incompetent, its meaning changes entirely. In that context, the story becomes less about insanity and more about ridicule. And ridicule is dangerous. Roman aristocrats could tolerate brutality. They had lived with it for centuries. But humiliation was another matter. It damaged reputation, undermined status, and threatened the social order on which their authority depended. Over time, the narrative surrounding Caligula hardened into something more convenient for his enemies. He was no longer merely an unpopular ruler. He was portrayed as something far worse: a tyrant driven by madness, a man incapable of rational government, a monster whose removal could be justified not as political ambition but as moral necessity. In Roman political culture, that distinction mattered enormously. Assassinating a legitimate emperor risked plunging the empire into chaos. Removing a mad tyrant, however, could be framed as an act of salvation. By the final year of Caligula's reign, the atmosphere within the imperial court had become increasingly dangerous. Praetorian officers watched carefully. Senators spoke cautiously. Rumors circulated through corridors and private villas alike. Some feared the emperor's next decision. Others had already begun to consider a more permanent solution. Because once a ruler has been successfully transformed into a monster in the public imagination, the final step becomes easier to justify. The conspiracy against Caligula was not born in a single moment. It grew slowly in wounded pride, whispered conversations, and the quiet belief that Rome would be better without its emperor. And soon, the men who controlled the empire's most powerful weapons would act on that belief. In the final chapter, we examine the assassination that ended Caligula's reign and the long shadow his legend would cast across Roman history. By the beginning of AD 41, the tension surrounding Caligula had reached a dangerous point. For nearly 4 years, the emperor had ruled with a style that many within Rome's elite considered intolerable. Humiliation had replaced cooperation, fear had replaced loyalty. And within the imperial court, certain men had begun to consider the unthinkable. The conspiracy that would end Caligula's life did not begin with the Senate. It began with the Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers entrusted with protecting the emperor. Among them was an officer named Cassius Dio. Ancient sources describe Dio as a man repeatedly mocked by Caligula during public ceremonies. The emperor, it is said, often assigned him degrading passwords when relieving the guard jokes meant to provoke laughter among the court. Whether these insults were playful or deliberate is impossible to know. But humiliation, once again, had consequences. On the 24th of January, AD 41, Caligula attended a series of public games held near the imperial palace. The atmosphere, according to surviving accounts, appeared entirely routine. Spectators filled the theater. Officials moved through the corridors. The emperor, accompanied by members of his household, withdrew briefly from the main arena to pass through a covered passageway connecting the palace complex. It was there that the conspirators struck. As Caligula walked through the narrow corridor, Praetorian officers stepped forward under the pretense of addressing him. Then the first blow fell. Ancient writers differ on the precise sequence of events, but most agree that Dio delivered the initial strike. Other guards followed almost immediately. Within moments, the emperor collapsed beneath a series of dagger wounds. Caligula was 28 years old. His reign had lasted less than 4 years. News of the assassination spread through the palace with astonishing speed. Panic erupted among courtiers and servants as soldiers rushed through the corridors. For a brief moment, Rome stood on the edge of chaos. Some members of the Senate reportedly hoped the death of Caligula might allow the Republic to be restored. Discussions began almost immediately about dismantling the imperial system entirely. But events moved faster than political theory. While searching the palace, Praetorian soldiers discovered a frightened figure hiding behind a curtain in a nearby chamber. It was Claudius, Caligula's uncle. According to the historian Suetonius, the guards initially believed he intended to surrender. Instead, they unexpectedly proclaimed him the new emperor. Within hours, the Roman Empire had a successor. The experiment of restoring the Republic vanished almost as quickly as it had been proposed. Caligula's body, meanwhile, was carried away quietly. His death, though violent, was not followed by the kind of public spectacle often associated with fallen tyrants. Instead, something more powerful began to take shape: a story. In the years that followed, Roman historians set about describing the reign that had just ended, and the portrait they produced was extraordinary. Caligula was no longer simply an emperor who had antagonized the Senate. In their accounts, he became something far more dramatic: a ruler consumed by madness, cruelty, and grotesque excess. The young prince, once welcomed by Rome, disappeared from the narrative. In his place stood a monster. Whether this transformation reflected historical truth, political revenge, or some complicated mixture of both remains one of the most enduring questions in Roman history. What we know for certain is this: Caligula ruled during a period when power in Rome rested upon fragile agreements between emperors, soldiers, and aristocrats. He disrupted those agreements. And when those alliances collapsed, the empire did what Rome had done many times before. It removed its ruler. But the story of Caligula did not end in that corridor. Because long after the daggers were put away, another struggle began, not for the throne, but for memory. And memory, once written into history, can outlive any emperor. So we are left with the same question that has followed Caligula for nearly 2,000 years. Was he truly the most unstable ruler Rome ever produced? Or was he a young emperor whose enemies proved far more successful at shaping the story of his reign than he ever was at ruling it? History offers us the legend. The truth may lie somewhere between the two.
History remembers Caligula as Rome's most insane emperor, a ruler who mocked the Senate, declared himself divine, and plunged the empire into chaos. But history is not written by neutral observers. It is written by survivors. And in Caligula's case, those survivors belonged almost entirely to the very class he had spent his reign humiliating. So the question remains: was Caligula truly the monster Roman historians describe? Or did Rome create that monster after his death? A mad emperor? Or the most successful smear campaign in Roman history? I'm curious where you stand. Tell me in the comments, tyrant or victim of propaganda. Thanks for watching.